a single flicker of awareness breaks through. The mind hushes, unsettled by the strange illumination. To exist is to suffer, and to suffer is to be alive. There is no comfort, here only the raw bones of truth. The candle's flame trembles, and in that tremble lies the heartbeat of being. Life moves like a silent avalanche, each moment gathering weight. In the morning's cold light, a man rises, his breath a small concession to existence. In the night's dark breath, he lies awake, haunted by the echo of mornings past. The pain of living is not an exception, but the substance of existence. It flows through every vessel of consciousness. Desire, attachment, longing, grief. We pretend otherwise, that happiness is a birthright, that contentment awaits us at some turn in the road. But these are illusions, sweet, dangerous illusions that bind us tighter to suffering. The quiet futility of wanting becomes clear as the wave crests, then crashes upon unseen shores. We chase after shadows, wealth, recognition, love, perfection. Each seeming triumph becomes a new hunger. Fill one void, and another yawns beneath it. The will is insatiable, a furnace that devours all it creates. No possession stills the flame, no triumph quenches the fire. Our lives are chained to this hunger, this relentless striving, and the world applauds the spectacle as if it were redemption. But this applause merely echoes our own self-deception. There is a sorrow in realization, sharp as winter's breath on naked skin. To see life clearly is to feel its weight, to recognize that death waits patiently behind every birth, that joy is temporary, that every connection contains the seed of loss. And yet, to flee from this truth is to live in half-light, where every promise is betrayal. The mind recoils, insists on distraction, flings itself at comfort. But the hand of comfort reaches into thin air. In each heart, the same story unfolds. We are born into suffering. The first cry, the first need it is suffering asserting itself. We grasp at nurturing arms, but they slip away. Growing, we feel the world's indifferent pressure, illness, loneliness, the inevitability of age. Our bodies betray us, our spirit aches for meaning as the tide of daily tasks pulls us under. We cling to stories, that love will last, that work redeems, that achievement justifies the anguish, and for a time we are consoled by these narratives. But the wind of impermanence whispers again. If only suffering had a conclusion, a goal beyond itself. Yet suffering is not preparation for something else. It is not a path to be followed or a trial to be endured. It is the shape of our existence. To vanquish it is to deny life itself. The question, then, is not how to escape suffering, but how to stand beside it with lucid eyes, to see without flinching, to allow pain its place without allowing it to define us. Every morning we wake, compelled by the same will that torments us. We remain, we desire, we suffer. And in our suffering, there is a strange oasis, the clarity of presence. When the seed of desire dissolves into naked seeing, we meet reality without veil. The world remains as it is harsh, fleeting, beautiful, and cruel in equal measure. And in that meeting, something within us stills. Not because the storm has abated, but because we have stopped fleeing. This stillness is not peace in the way the world craves it. It is not the end of desire. It is the moment when the dance between subject and object pauses, and we taste ourselves as nothing behind the thoughts. A faint echo of freedom, a blank space in the heart of chaos, and for one split breath, the suffering does not swell, not because it is gone, but because it is seen. Yet the will persists, and the next wave arrives. The mind resumes its coil. Again we cry, cling, ache. The cycle spins, but each turning offers an opportunity to glimpse pause. In the ache, a fissure opens. In the craving, a doorway appears. And to see is a small deliverance, though the world remains. The chain does not fall at once. Modernity offers illusions refined and gilded endless distractions to anesthetize the ache. Screens that glow with promise, products that whisper completion, movements that seduce with false hope. Yet beneath the neon haze, the same emptiness persists. We consume the spectacle, craving novelty, validation, belonging. We scroll through lives that glisten and fade, and in their reflection we grasp at worth. We look to others to confirm our value, as if their gaze could fill the void. But all is ephemeral, all is passing smoke, and in the quiet after the climax of distraction, the ache remains. True liberation is not found in more pleasure, but in the refusal of the anesthetic. not in denying the world's pain, but in refusing to numb ourselves to it, to let the ache echo, to witness the flame flicker, to know that all life trembles on the brink. In this witnessing, there is compassion, not the sentiment of comfort, but a sober tenderness toward existence. We stop demanding other than what is. We open to the flow of sorrow and joy without assertion or aversion, and the heart becomes a vessel, not a fortress. This is not triumph. There is no celebratory crowning of victory. We do not transcend suffering. We become transparent to it. We find that the will, when undirected, loses its compulsive shimmer. It still applies, it still moves, but without the frantic grasping. In the center of the storm, we find silence, not because the storm has ceased, but because we have ceased struggling against it. Here, at the edge of desire, there is a slow sigh, the recognition that the will is doom. And yet in that doom exists a kind of dawning, the end of the story that told us we are what we want. We remain, aware of breath, of blood, of hours passing like leaves on water. We remain, not hopeful, but calm, not solved, but awake. We become the lantern, not hoping for dark to vanish, but holding light steady against the void. The monologue drifts, then dissolves, as the candle guttering reveals the room in shadows. The silence is not absence, but presence more vast, more tender than all noise. And there is no finish line, only this. The will cannot find rest in anything, but in the transparency of its own motion it glimpses the stillness it sought, not in triumph, but in surrender. The lantern dims. There is a strange dignity in admitting defeat, not the defeat of battle, but the quiet collapse of illusion. To awaken is not to conquer, but to see with unclouded vision that nothing we pursued was ever meant to soothe the root of our anguish. The world, with all its brightness, seduces us into believing that satisfaction lies just ahead. Yet each promise peels away upon contact, revealing the same bleak core. Every desire fulfilled begets a new thirst. The mirage moves, but the desert remains. We do not suffer because we are flawed. We suffer because we are conscious. A stone does not ache. A tree does not yearn. But the human mind, cursed with foresight and memory, drowns in what could be, what should have been, what might never come. The beast suffers its wound and moves on. We, however, carry our wounds like sacred heirlooms, polishing them with thought, embedding them in identity. We confuse pain for meaning, and meaning for permanence, and thus we ache even more. Every pleasure, once tasted, leaves behind its ghost. We remember the sweetness, then feel its absence more sharply than its presence. And yet we chase again, as if the next touch, the next thrill, the next person might redeem the futility of the last. We live in echoes, not in presence. And the echoes fade. That is the tragedy. That is the design. The will pushes forward, ravenous, creating the illusion of direction where there is only repetition. To step back is not to withdraw from life, but to step out of the trance. Detachment is not apathy, it is the refusal to be deceived. It is the sober glance that sees the lover not as salvation, but as another suffering being, reaching blindly like ourselves. It is seeing beauty not as promise, but as a flickering, vanishing shimmer on the surface of decay. In detachment, the heart does not grow cold, it grows clear. It learns to witness without possession, to love without claim, to breathe without clinging to the air. Modern minds are taught to fear emptiness. We fill every silence, every idle moment, with noise, with images, with motion. But silence is not the enemy. It is the only place where truth speaks. In the quiet, we hear the rustling of the self, the endless commentary of ego, the cry of the will. It is unsettling, yes, but only because we have grown estranged from ourselves. Emptiness is not a void to escape, it is the space from which we see the false shape of all things. And what is this self we guard so ferociously? A flickering mask worn over the abyss. We build identities from memory, emotion, belief, but each of these is impermanent, unstable. Strip them away, and there is no center, only awareness. And yet we suffer for this mask. We defend it, embellish it, mourn it when it cracks. The self is a fiction whispered by desire. And like all fictions, it must end. If one could stand at the edge of being and see the whole spectacle at once, the births and deaths, the hungers and disillusionments, the triumphs that decay into regret, it would be clear. Existence is not a gift, but a burden the will imposes upon itself. Life is the will turned outward, and the world is its torment. All joy contains its opposite. all hope its failure. The smile anticipates the tear, as surely as the sun anticipates the night. This is not nihilism, this is truth divested of ornament. The absence of sugar is not bitterness, it is clarity. To accept suffering not as punishment, but as the very shape of life, is to finally cease resisting what is. And in that surrender, a strange peace arrives not because the storm has ended, but because we no longer believe it unjust. The soul no longer demands rescue. There remains no enemy but illusion, no prison but the craving to escape what is, no freedom but in watching the will spin and tire itself into stillness. Let it ache, let it reach, and let it be seen. That is all. The observer is not bound by the story it watches. It is the flame, not the flicker, and even suffering, when illuminated, becomes part of the stillness. Thus the voice falls quieter, not because there is less to say, but because there is less to seek. The soul withdraws, not in fear, but in reverence. There is nowhere to go. There is nothing to become. The waves will continue, but beneath them, a silence vast enough to contain them all. The breath settles, the will pauses. And what remains is not despair, but the gentle dissolution of need. There is no freedom in the act of becoming. Every step toward a desired state is already chained to the unrest that birthed it. The moment the will moves, it disrupts the quietude of being, turning serenity into striving. This is the cruelty of the human condition. We are compelled to move, to change, to ascend, yet every movement carries us further from stillness. We are not punished for our desires, we are punished by them. The object of longing is not a balm, but a bait. The chase begins, and with it, the wound. Even love, this most exalted of torments, reveals itself as the will in disguise. We call it union, connection, transcendence. Yet beneath the veil lies a hunger not for the other, but for ourselves reflected back, adorned, desired, made real through mirrored attention. The lover is but a mask worn by the will, promising wholeness, delivering dependency. And when love falters, when the mask slips, we do not grieve the other. We grieve the death of the illusion that we could ever be saved by another's gaze. And how we build civilizations on this trembling foundation. We sculpt ideals, erect monuments, compose symphony soul in rebellion against decay. Culture is the will sublimated, ornamented, made temporarily bearable. We glorify the struggle, call it art, history, destiny. But behind every masterpiece lies a scream subdued, repressed, reinterpreted as triumph. No empire is born from peace. No cathedral stands without the crushed stones of countless wills ground beneath its beauty. The world admires the crown but forgets the skull beneath it. To detach from this spectacle is not to renounce life, but to cease being fooled by its masks. One begins to see the dance for what it is, not a progression toward meaning, but a repetition of the same ancient ache. Birth, desire, striving, disappointment again and again, with new costumes, new languages, new distractions. The forms change, the suffering remains. What we call progress is only the refining of illusion. The modern soul, though clothed in convenience, suffers more acutely. It is not the absence of struggle that torments it, it is the absence of meaning beneath abundance. When all needs are met, the soul confronts its own emptiness. We no longer starve for bread, but for silence, for truth, for something untouched by transaction. But the world gives us algorithms instead of insight, noise instead of depth. We scroll not for knowledge, but for numbness. We share not to connect, but to feel briefly real. And behind every post, a loneliness unspoken. The crowd, once gathered around the fire for warmth and story, now disperses into private kingdoms of distraction. Each person a screen, each screen a mirror, each mirror reflecting the same fear, that we are alone and that our pain is not special. We run from this sameness, create identities, causes, spiritual masks, but all are scaffolds built upon the same void. We cry for authenticity while performing every moment. Even our rebellion is choreographed. Yet something within us still longs to see clearly. Amid the smoke of performance and noise, a faint yearning stirs not for happiness, but for lucidity. This is the beginning of detachment. Not the cold apathy of the defeated, but the tender disillusionment of the awakened. The world does not cease to hurt, it simply ceases to enchant. One sees the puppet strings, the machinery of desire. One sees the will at work, tireless, ravenous, absurd, and in seeing, one ceases to obey. To live in this awareness is not to float above life, but to walk through it without clinging. The flower is still fragrant, but it is not yours. The sunset is still beautiful, but it does not promise anything. You begin to love without needing, to speak without persuading, to breathe without demanding permanence. The will still flickers, but it no longer rules. It becomes a wind passing through the hauserknot, the house itself. And death once, the terror that shaped all striving, becomes something else entirely. Not an end, but a return. The flame goes out, and with it, the agitation of wanting. The person disappears, but so too does the torment of selfhood. In this light, death is not cruelty, but release. The body, the thoughts, the longing seach laid down like a burden no longer needed. And what remains? Not a soul ascending, not a narrative fulfilled, but silence. And in that silence, the final truth. That what we are was never a thing, but a flicker in the dark, a ripple in the stillness. Do not fear this silence. It is not empty, is free. The will that howled through every lifetime, demanding, resisting, aching now rests. And in its resting, a beauty unknown to striving emerges. A beauty that asks for nothing, proves nothing, contains everything. The sea does not weep when the wave dissolves. It simply returns to stillness. So too do we. And thus the voice continues not louder, but deeper, as if descending through layers of illusion toward the bedrock of being. Each word, not a torch of hope, but a lantern of clarity. Let it burn quietly. Let it show what is. Let it leave nothing hidden. To live is to be pierced, over and over, by the same realization. Nothing lasts, and nothing is enough. Even in moments of laughter, a shadow looms, the silent certainty that what now warms the heart will soon leave it cold. The world offers its pleasures like rain upon scorched earth, only to vanish before thirst is quenched. And yet we return always. We return to the spring that dries up, the touch that recedes, the dream that dissolves at dawn. What is memory but a museum of ghosts? We preserve images not to relive them, but to mourn their passing. The child we once were, the faces we once loved, the futures we once imagined, they live in us like unfulfilled prayers, suspended in amber. We think we remember joy, but what we recall is the pain of its disappearance. Nostalgia is not sweetness. It is the ache of recognition that what was will never be again. Even our thoughts betray us. The mind is not sanctuary, but labyrinth walls of reflection echoing the will's demands. We imagine clarity, but thought itself is shaped by desire. Every idea bends beneath the weight of wanting. We seek truth, but what we truly seek is refuge from suffering. And so, the truths we accept are often those that soothe rather than expose. The will disguises itself in logic, in philosophy, in belief, but it is always there hollow-eyed, whispering of something more. What we call identity is a costume stitched from pain. The roles we play, the parent, the lover, the artist, the rebel, are responses to the wound of being. We invent ourselves not to express, but to distract. Behind every assertion of self lies the fear of its absence. The ego, clinging to form, constructs meaning out of motion, but it cannot bear stillness. In stillness, the self dissolves, and with it, the illusion of control. And what of beauty, that fleeting balm? It wounds as much as it heals. A sunset, a melody, a face each, arrests the heart, then vanishes. Beauty is not fulfillment, but reminder. It points to something beyond grasp, then slips away. Its very transience is what stirs us, for we know, deep beneath the surface, that all we love will fade. To love beauty is to ache with awareness of impermanence. Thus, detachment is not indifference. It is the unflinching gaze turned toward what is. It is not the refusal to feel, but the refusal to be fooled. In detachment, one does not turn away from life, but stops begging it to provide what it cannot. One sees the dance and no longer reaches for the dancer. The fire still burns, but one no longer walks into it hoping for warmth without flame. Silence grows sacred in such clarity. Not the silence of absence, but of presence, the kind that listens without responding, that watches without needing. In this silence, suffering remains, but it no longer owns us. It becomes part of the atmosphere, like the wind or the rain felt, but not feared. And in this space, one breathes differently, no longer asking the world to make sense, but allowing it to simply be senseless. To relinquish the will is not to fall into passivity. It is to cease the internal resistance that makes suffering intolerable. Pain without resistance becomes sensation. Grief without resistance becomes reverence. Even despair, seen without the lens of judgment, becomes a form of truth, heavy, yes, but clear. There is dignity in no longer pretending. The world does not owe us peace. It does not bend to our longing. The stars do not burn for our stories. The seasons turn whether we weep or rejoice. This indifference is not cruelty, it is freedom. When we no longer expect the world to comfort us, we stop measuring its worth by our satisfaction. And in that space, a quiet reverence awakens, not for what the world gives, but for what it simply is. There is no remedy for existence. There is only the understanding of its nature. And in that understanding, a strange kind of rest. Not joy, not solace, but the cessation of struggle. The wave still rises, but we do not chase it. The flame still flickers, but we do not worship it. We sit in the ash, and in the ash, we find something true and not exalted, not triumphant, but real. Thus, we continue, not because there is something to gain, but because the breath still comes. Each step is not a march toward destiny, but a footfall into the unknown. We walk not for reward, but because we have not yet fallen. And even that this small act of remaining is a form of defiance against the will's despair. We endure not to overcome, but to witness. And so the lantern remains lit, not to light the way forward, but to keep the darkness honest. The gaze that once darted toward promise begins to turn inward, not in search of escape, but in surrender to the wound that never heals. We come to see that beneath the surface of all movement lies a singular rhythm, the restlessness of the will, seeking what it cannot name. The child reaches for toys, the adult for power or permanence, but the gesture is the same, a hand groping through mist that thickens with each attempt to grasp. The tragedy is not that the mist is empty, but that the hand persists. To live is to be haunted by the false proximity of satisfaction. It stands just beyond the next embrace, the next success, the next insight. But the closer we approach, the more it recedes, as if reality itself were mocking our need. We build futures like fragile altars to house our longing, but the future never arrives. It is always becoming, never being. And in the space between now and what we seek, the will spins, devouring the present to feed the illusion of tomorrow. And so we suffer not from the cruelty of fate, but from the structure of longing. The ache is not accidental. It is the axis around which the wheel of life turns. Remove the ache, and nothing moves. But allow the ache to rule, and we are consumed. This is the paradox from which there is no exit. One cannot will the end of will. To desire non-desire is still to desire. The snake turns inward and swallows its own tail, thinking it has found the way out. The wise do not flee this paradox. They inhabit it. They let the ache speak, but do not let it decide. They feel the rising of the will, but do not ride its wave. Instead, they watch, like one observing storm clouds from the safety of a high cliff. The rain still falls. The wind still howls, but the observer remains unmoved. This is not detachment through numbness. It is detachment through insight. The knowledge that all striving is rooted in illusion gives rise to a strange stillness, a stillness not of peace, but of refusal. And the world continues, indifferent. The sun does not pause for the sufferer. The seasons do not mourn our loss. Time, that great devourer, marches unfeelingly across the landscape of our years, turning all we build, all we love, all we believe, to dust. We speak of legacy, of meaning, of making a mark, but the earth forgets even the most persistent footprint. It rains, and the shape vanishes. The sky does not remember the cry of the dying. The sea does not carry names in its waves. This forgetfulness is not cruelty, it is liberation. For what could be more tormenting than a universe that took our pain personally? Better the indifference of the cosmos than the burden of divine scrutiny. We suffer in anonymity, and in that anonymity we are free. Free to weep without audience, free to vanish without consequence. And if we are forgotten, we are also unbound. The ego recoils at this. It wants to matter. It wants to echo beyond its breath. But in truth, the longing to matter is the source of much torment. To be someone, to be recognized, to be remembered, these are the veils we cling to, afraid of the void behind them. Yet the void is not hostile. It is only honest. In the void, we are not less we, are simply no longer distorted by the mirror of craving. Thus, to release the need to matter is not a loss, it is a return to the simplicity that precedes the self, to walk beneath the trees and no longer wonder what they think of us, to breathe and not measure the breath, to act not for effect, but because the moment called for it. This is not asceticism, it is transparency. One becomes like glass seen through, not because one is empty, but because one no longer obstructs the light. Even suffering, when allowed to be seen clearly, loses its sting. It does not vanish, but it transforms. It becomes no longer a punishment, but a presence like cold air on skin. The pain is real, but the interpretation fades. One ceases to ask, "Why me?" and begins to ask only, "What is this?" In this shift, despair gives way to observation. The soul stops flailing and begins to float. And the floating is not aimless, it is quiet. A drifting not away from life, but deeper into its essence. The recognition that even meaning is a construct of will, a map drawn by a hand that refuses to stand still. But once the hand rests, the map fades. And with it, the illusion that we were ever going anywhere. We are not journeying. We are dwelling in a moment, in a breath, in the space between two thoughts. The self, stripped of narrative, becomes a clearing. Not a void, but a quiet presence. In this clearing, the world does not cease to be painful, but it ceases to be personal. And that is enough. That is the beginning of the end of torment. Not in changing the world, but in ceasing to filter it through the broken lens of desire. So let the flame burn low. Let the movement slow. Let the eyes close. Not in sleep, but in surrender. And when they open again, may they see not what is missing, but what has always been quietly enough. And now the light begins to dim, not abruptly, but like dusk bleeding into the bones of the earth. The voice quiets not because it is finished, but because there is nothing left to chase. The words slow, as the will slackens, like a tide pulling back into the eternal hush. No climax, no crescendo, only the long fading breath of understanding. All things that strive toward something dissolve into the stillness of what simply is. The river that rushed, carved, raged against rock and time, comes at last to the sea, where all motion ceases to matter. It does not returns, so too the self, so too the longing. There is no final reward, no unveiling of purpose, only the absence of the demand that there should be. The pain that threaded through each day, the ache that curled beneath each joy, no longer seeks explanation. It does not vanish, but it becomes weightless, as a shadow cast by a moon that no longer demands light. It follows, but does not bind. It lingers, but does not speak. Suffering loses its sting not by healing, but by being seen in its true form, not as error, but as the shape of life itself. And so, the soul, weary of stories, releases the illusion of trajectory. It does not fall, it sinks, into quiet, into being, into the groundless space where nothing needs to be other than what it is. The fever of becoming cools, the mirror of the self cracks, and the image bleeds into silence. There is no tragedy here, only the end of expectation. There is no triumph, only the breath that no longer reaches. In this stillness, the world remains unchanged. The wind still moves the branches, the blood still flows, people still love, lose, search, forget. But the one who watches no longer hopes to be delivered. That burden has been laid down. The flame of will flickers to its end, not extinguished by force, but by the exhaustion of its own fire. It has burned all it could, and finds now, at last, the peace of non-demand. There are no parting revelations, no final wisdom rising above the ashes. Only this, the realization that we have never owned a single thing, not even ourselves. All that passed through us was passing through. All that we called ours was merely on its way to elsewhere. Even the sorrow, even the joy. They came like visitors, and they leave like silence. The soul that surrenders no longer asks the world to bend. It no longer cries out in the night. It opens, instead, to the cold sky and does not flinch. It opens to the empty room and does not despair. For in that emptiness is the last refuge, the one not offered by gods or lovers or victories, but by the absence of need. There, at the edge of all that was ever sought, is the fading echo of the will. And when it fades completely, what remains is not void, but vastness. This is the end, not of the self, but of the dream of self. The silence is not death, it is rest, and into it we dissolve not as loss, but as return, not as vanquished, but as vanished. No more to strive, no more to name, only the still, clear air where nothing clings, and the soul, at last, forgets to hunger. The candle gutters, the room fades, and what remains is not darkness, but the absence of longing for light.